We're now going to cover subdivision surfaces. Any polygonal object can in fact be a subdivision surface. Underneath the object, in the geometry approximation, we will find polymesh options. The first is just the discontinuity angle. This changes how smooth looking or angular looking the object is. The other one is the subdivisions. The standard rule is the Catmull-Clark. If I were to up the OpenGL level, you can see that the polygonal object now becomes a bit more smooth. This is because, in fact, it's adding detail in between each point. If we were to see exactly this detail, I'm going to go into the display options and turn off simplified subdivided wireframe. So here we can see where the detail is being added. If I were to go up another level, you can see it's subdividing it again. I can also turn on inside here the polymesh hulls. So here is my original object, it being a polygon mesh, it now just gets subdivided. The reason we have two sliders inside here is we can control the OpenGL level and we can control the render level. So there is my render, and yet in OpenGL it's still angular. This will just speed up any interaction. In addition to Catmull-Clark, we also have the exercise du Sabin. If we were to look at the amount of detail here, I'm going to do Shift S to open up the camera visibility options, and I'm going to just turn on the selection info. If I were to reduce the amount of detail here and go back to Catmull-Clark, as I up the resolution, we can see the amount of information. So this is a single level of subdivision and another level of subdivision, and we can see the number of triangles updating here. Switching to du Sabin, we can see that it actually has considerably more triangles. And finally we have linear. Now linear is, as you can see, doing the subdivisions, but perhaps isn't best for organic shapes. It's really for things which you want to deform without having to add a sort of rounding effect. The selection of components for subdivisions, if I were to start clicking on the hull, you can see that's just a reflection of my grabbing this here. If I were to turn the hull off, I can simply grab these points like so. So switching to selection mode, you can see it's much easier to select, particularly at acute angles. Now this method is using the geometry approximation, and as such is not creating a new object, it's just subdividing the current object. When I hit plus and minus on the keyboard, plus, plus, minus, minus, as you can see here, it's just changing the subdivision level. If we were to look at a cube and apply a texture to this, I'm simply going to do the cubic map and switch to texture decal. Now when I up the subdivision level, you can see the, if I put it both here, you can see that the textures are propagating down. All the components from weight maps, textures, materials, deformations, animation, is all maintained because we're just changing the underlying structure of the polygonal mesh. We also have the ability to create a new subdivision from this existing polymesh. So if I go polymesh subdivision, what can we transfer? Well, right now we do the UVs, the textures and the materials. The deformations and animation and that sort of thing is currently living only on this object, but this is the creation of a new object. We can edit individual materials, UVs, and the textures will therefore propagate. If I were just to hit transfer all, there you can see. As with all modeling operations, it is in fact relational. So when I start to manipulate this, it will manipulate and propagate through to the subdivided object. As soon as I freeze or freeze the modeling, that relationship is gone. If I undo this, I can still change the relationship here. So I'm going to switch back to shaded so you can see it a bit better. Now if I were to say take this and maybe do an extrusion, and I still go back to this guy, we still maintain that relationship, even if I were to say extrude this or subdivide it. So let's just subdivide it like so. So I've subdivided, and yet this has gone all a bit funny. That's because I've changed the ordering of my original structure. If I undo this, we can see this has only a set number of sides. In this case for the cube it's 6, and this has considerably more. So we've indexed this single face here, number 3, referencing these two here. When I subdivide, I now have in fact 4 faces, and there is number 3. This is now number 7, number 6, and the last. So the references from this guy is going, oh, well, I'm still attached to number 3, therefore I'm going to shift over here because the indexing has shifted here. Something to bear in mind. We can also generate a duplicate using the geometry approximation. But why has it got so many triangles? Well, if we were to look at the geometry approximation, this guy, he actually had a subdivision level of 3. And this guy, there we go, inherited that subdivision level. So whatever this has, it inherits the geometry approximation values, so we just reduced it back down to 0, and it was a reflection of this now. The fact that we can propagate all textures and materials does make this slightly redundant, but what it does do is this: loses its relationship. So if you just want to do it while it loses the relationship and just generates and propagates all the textures and UVs automatically, then that's what it's for. So subdivision surfaces is an extension of the polygons. and therefore any operation you do to a polygon can also work with the subdivision surface. If I were to draw a curve here and go into its geometry approximation, if I were to look at the display here, you can see I'm just changing the number of steps in between the points. If I hit plus on the keyboard, I'm also just changing and subdividing that. So the plus minus on the keyboard is a subdivision level, whereas the polygonal objects, when we do plus and minus, is changing the subdivision level on the polygonal object. We can use this method for things like hair as well. For manipulation, if I were to switch back to shaded mode and just frame this up, I cannot grab the interpolated points for the subdivision surfaces. I would only do that if I were to generate, as with this, an extra level. Like so. And now I have access to each of the individual points there. Whereas this one, when I move a point, I can only move it, it's going to be removing snapping here, I can only move it relative to the hull. If I were to turn on the polymesh hull, now when we have a look at this object, if I were to try and grab this point, I can simply move this point here. When I take this off, that point still exists here, but I want to move it by clicking on this point, and it shows me where it actually exists and therefore where it's going to go. The same is with things like edges. I can grab the edge but not the interpolated parts inside here. And of course I can grab the polygons.